Assalamu alaikum. Eid Mubarak.
Eid Mubarak.
I am your presenter, Mandekh, and welcome to Bulsho Cup. Bulsho Cup is a monthly online discussion series on the components of nation building. For societies transitioning out of conflict, a primary focus is often resurrecting the fabrics of the state, from state institutions to rebuilding bonds between people. This series is issue-centered and focused primarily on Somalia, but examples of countries with similar conditions may be discussed. Each episode of this series will host a guest discussant and focus on one component crucial for rebuilding a nation. We welcome your feedback and suggestions and hope you enjoy the series. So welcome to our first episode on nation building. This episode will introduce the series and the topic of nation building. It will provide an overview of the components that are required to rebuild a nation, such as peace building, acquiring legitimacy for political systems, monopoly over violence, and strengthening the economy. And each subsequent episode will follow through with this. I welcome you today to our first discussant, Dr. Abdi Ismail Samater. He is a professor and chair of the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society at the University of Minnesota, and a research fellow at the University of Pretoria. He is the author of 4 books, including the most recent book, Africa's First Democrats, which is a political biography of Somalia's first civilian leaders, Aden Osman and Abdurrazzaq Haji Hussein. So, Professor, my first question to you is, how would you define nation building?
It's a gigantic, titanic task, but it begins in one particular place. And that place is a common civic identity of the population. One of the ways in which the colonial regimes tried to manage Africans and third worlders was to create many identities in the same communities, and for each identity be to connect it to the colonial authority. But they were not connected to one another politically. Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, probably one of the leading Africanist scholar, wrote a short essay, but it's part of a bigger book called Keywords. And he says that the mother of all dictatorships was the colonial authority, whether it was British or German or French or American or whoever else, Portuguese. Because one of the things fundamental to those regimes was to undo the cultural commonalities of those people such that they began to segregate them into this tribe, and that tribe. And each tribe was independently connected to the colonial authority without interconnections between themselves in the era of politics. So the liberation movements, which is the first step in nation building, was about creating a collective civic political identity. The Somali people existed on the landscape of the Somaliland, as I called it, long before there was a political center of gravity for the country, okay? That came as a product of, like many other places in the world, in reaction against the British and the Italians and the Ethiopians and the French and whoever else. And what those movements from sort of Ahmed Gurey in the 1500s to Muhammad Abdullah Hassan in the late part of the 18th century and 19th century and early part of the 20th century was to try to cultivate in the best way they knew how to create that common political identity rather than a collective cultural identity. We already had a cultural identity. We were Somalis. One of the marvelous things the Somali people did in the most difficult of circumstances was to create a language where people spoke virtually the same language on a territory that's literally the size of Texas or the size of France without modern technology or whatnot. It's a major, major achievement to speak to the question that Nasir raised earlier on. So creating common civic identity is the beginning of nation building.
Thank you. And to follow through with that, we're in 2017 and we're trying to go forward? And how are we able to continue developing this sense of common identity in this current era? And what other requirements do you see as being necessary to rebuild the nation, whether that be the state institutions or otherwise?
I mean, one can think it's a very complex project. I mean, Humpty Dumpty has fallen apart.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So it's a we are in a place, the Somali people are in a place where nobody has been in the last 300, 400, 500 years. A state collapses, the nation disintegrates, and then there are enemies from everywhere who are trying to make sure that it never comes back. So that's one task. The other task is the destruction of that common identity. If you go to a part of the country, kids are not learning about their history, whatever it was, whether it was cruel history or good history or both. They are not learning that. And so my sense, at least, if there were some place to begin, that some place has to be the faith that most Somali people share, and that's Islam, for instance. Islam not as political, Islam as a common base out of which civic identity can grow out of. We share the Islamic faith with all Muslims, 1.5 billion people. So we cannot be citizens of that. I mean, in the contemporary world where there are borders and passports, we can't go. Yusuf cannot just go to Saudi Arabia and say, I'm a Muslim, I'm coming to the Hajj, I don't need a passport. Hell no, that won't happen. The Saudis won't allow you to do that. And so but we can begin something that overlaps Somali and cultural Islamic and cultural identity of the Somalis can become a base. How do we do that? I've been arguing for quite some time that two groups of people need to be extracted out of politics. People of the cloth, that's faith, religious people, and people of culture, okay? And those two groups have things, whether it's Hatrawi or the late Yam Yam, whether it was Muhammad Abdullah Hassan or it was Abdullah Sultan Timad, it doesn't matter, have to be extracted so that their responsibility, and we all chip in to support their livelihoods, so that wherever there is collective problem in a community, in a region, they are the ones who go there, and they have no stake in getting a position of power as a president or prime minister or regional governor or whatnot. Okay? So for me, I think that Somalis have enormous entrepreneurial capacity. Idil was telling me the other day, Dr. Idil was telling me the other day, why are Somalis so successful in business and so poor and impoverished in politics? Okay? It's a major, major theoretical and existential question. Okay? So I think one of the ways we can do is if we can pull our sort of a civil resources together, you and I pay into a fund that goes to those selected individuals, maybe 15 to 20 people, who go across the country talking about the ideas of belonging to one another, the ideas of civic reconstruction, okay? And they are completely independent of government. Government cannot touch them. And if the government messes up things, they can speak forcefully to that on the basis that they are not interested in politics, but they are interested in the collective identity of the Somali people. And I think through their sort of a depth in the faith of Islam and depth in the cultural byways of the Somali people, we might have a source, a fountain of rejuvenation in those two groups, in my opinion.
Fantastic. And to pull out the thread of the sense of developing sense of belonging and civic reconstruction, what steps do you think Somalia has taken in recent years towards this? In your research and in your work, what have you seen being done on the ground in the nation and amongst the diaspora to ensure that there is this great effort towards ensuring that there's a sense of belonging, not just between those in the state, but the diaspora who seems to be returning?
I think what I see here is, the advantage of a teacher like myself, I think, is that because of the internet, among other things, I get tons and tons of emails almost every day. Some from peers in North America or Europe, but mostly from Somalis. First thing I do in the office in the morning is when I turn the machine on and I look at the news to see if there are any crises anywhere in the world that I need to be mindful of is then to look at my email and then respond to those I think are urgent. And these are young men and women writing from the country, whether it's in Zayla or whether in Kismayo or anywhere in between. And then, of course, the diaspora. And very few of them, if ever, write to me about the particularity of their ethnicity. Very few ever do that. There are few people who will say, oh, you are so crossed with rare hebel, or you are crossed with this rare hebel, and I said, hallelujah. Okay. And but they are more concerned about education, how they can be upright Somalis, how they can contribute to the idea of rebuilding, and so on and so forth. So young people who are in school, the majority of young people are not in school, unfortunately, in the country itself, whether it's in the north or in the south. Okay, but I see this as a major glimmer of hope, because they are all talking in the same language. When I go to Mogadishu, when I go to Garawa, when I went to Kismayo a few weeks ago, I'm just amazed by the sense of hope these young people have, by their excitement to take on the challenge, okay, and by the expectations that something better is going to happen. I think, so the energy is there. You know, the famous sort of a left scholar and practitioner in Italy by the name Gramsci wrote in his prison notes that a society is like an engine, okay? And if you think of the engine, and if you put fuel into the engine, the fuel will flow through the pipes, but there has to be a center that's able to translate sort of a potential energy into kinetic energy. Scientists will understand this, or your high school physics will allow you to do that. Potential energy, this is potential energy, but it cannot move. You put something in there and it cracks the system and it gives us energy, active energy, okay? And so that energy that exists both in the country and outside is disorganized, it's leaderless, yeah? There are sentiments and ideas, but the purpose is not as crystal clear as it should be. And so what is lacking is the organizational resources that will translate that sort of a potential energy into civic national energy that will transform the place.
And what efforts can we do to ensure that there is a sense of equitable access, that all individuals, regardless of what area of social class or economic class, whether in Somalia or outside, are able to engage in the sense of civic engagement and civic building? So that the efforts, for example, are not remaining within only academia or only within the politics or only within the sheikhs.
I thought I was going to get easy answer questions, but she's quite a tough lady.
Thanks.
And I think Somali people at one level are incredibly egalitarian. And where, you know, I'll just walk into Yusuf's house and expect that Khadija will feed me, his wife and partner. Without alerting them early enough that, well, hey, Yusuf, I'm coming, so be prepared that hungry stomach is going to walk into your house. That kind of generosity. And let me give you an example in Kismayo. We went to a village at the mouth of the Juba River in the Indian Ocean called Gobwain. And I don't drink tea nor coffee. But when we got there, you know, the folks came around, you know, a very, very small village with an incredible potential. And they brought tea, they brought water, they brought melons, and you could see from their faces that these are people who don't have a lot. Okay, but they were willing to part with that. I'm not a fat guy, but I am okay. I'm healthy and eat reasonably well. Some of the other guys who were with me were a bit chubbier than I am. Yeah. And so that generosity exists regardless of class. I come from America, I'm a big professor, blah, 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 blah. These people have nothing, but they have Iman, which is very interesting. That's what gives them the ability to share. And so my sense is that there are, from my studies over the last 30 years, I am absolutely convinced, beyond any shadow of doubt, that every Somali child should be able to have enough protein and carbohydrates and vitamins every morning on her and his plate. The resources are there. The fish is there. The capacity to produce grains is there. The protein of the livestock is there. What it lacks is an organizational institutions that can translate that into something else. And so, it's quite conceivable. I don't need to have a fat stomach. In Kenya, they call it the Wabanzis. You know, the guys who have big stomachs and who measure their wealth, but how close it comes to the steering wheel. Okay? And there are new Wabanzis in Somalia. I don't need to become a man with a big stomach for the folks in Gobwain to have sort of meals that are sufficient enough to maintain their health. So the raw materials is there. Again, what is lacking is the kind of an organized force by young people, both inside and outside the country, who will challenge both the provincial and the national authority that this should never happen in our watch again.
Thank you. And for one final parting note for our audience, what would you say would be the one tool that individuals on an everyday basis can use to ensure that this sense of community building and civic nationality building can be progressed?
Well, I'm going to answer that question with a question, not to you, but to the audience. How many of you drink coffee? Raise your hand, please. How many of you drink tea? How many of you buy bottled water every day? Virtually everybody here buys something of that kind. How much does a cup of coffee cost in Britain?
£2 something.
£2.50? How much does a cup of tea cost?
£1.
About the same? About 50? So between 250 and 150, let's say two. Mm-hmm. How much does a bottle of water cost?
£1 something.
£1 something? Okay. Well, here's my proposition that you can do without any pain, unless you are so addicted to caffeine that you are a hopeless prospect. Skip 1 cup of coffee and 1 cup of tea and 1 bottle of water and invest that in a Somali child's education in the country. That's the first thing that you can do. We have done that for people in Mogadishu, for people in the north of the country and elsewhere. And we are beginning that project in Kismayo. Okay? So organize, but you need to have the organization so that your $2 or £2 can go into that immediately. And it always goes to, the lump sum always goes to the least developed part of the country and the most needy part of the country. That's the proposition.
Thank you very much, Professor, for answering my questions. And now I open it up to the audience.
I think the late Ambassador Mohammed Osman wrote about Somalia. I think he hypothesized Somalia turning into a trusteeship and going back to the old days. And that is something the UN and it is Western backers are working on, given the complex federal system that is imposed on them and that there's nothing going on and the deadlines of the one man, one vote, which is not happening. Do you think there is going to be some kind of trusteeship learning in the dark?
And I knew Mohammed not very well, but reasonably well, and I have most of his books in my office, the major one being The Scramble for the Horn of Africa, for instance. The Road to Hell, among others. I don't think a trusteeship is in the cards. The devil in me might say yeah, let them do it, and then we'll have a liberation war, and then we'll redo it all over again. I don't think that's really in the cards. I think a much more probable scenario is that the balkanization will become so deep that over a period of time, that people will be so alienated from one another, they will have no longer a common history. And therefore, that slow process of death, if you like, will take its toll over time. And you can see that, despite the energy of the young people that I talked about. Okay? I mean, when I was a PhD student, my advisor was a Brit who moved to America, Michael Watts. Wrote a famous book, very thick book, called Silent Violence. Violence comes in two forms, at least. One's the bloody one that I will get the gun and shoot you, and you spray your brain across the floor and with blood and the whole lot. And then the other violence is an everyday violence, but that almost impoverishes the spirit and the body, so that you are slowly dying, but you are not conscious of it. But ultimately you will perish and it will kill you. Okay? The second one is deadlier than the first one because it's not visible to the naked eye. And so I think the strategy from my vantage point, and they will not admit this, is that over time they will become little Bantustans, okay, that anybody can walk in and walk out. I mean, think of the piracy issue. I don't know how many of you I wrote a piece about 7 years ago on what I call the dialectics of piracy in Somalia, the rich versus the poor. Up to $450 million of fishes is stolen every year from the Somali people since 1991. Every year. If you multiply that by 20 years, it's about $9 billion, $10 billion. That alone will enable us to rebuild the country. But who is going to bring that money back? From the Japanese, from the Italians, from the Portuguese, from sort of the Indians, from the Chinese, and a whole lot more. Okay? Slow death, if you like. And so the challenge is not to bemoan about the terrible things that are happening to us, but to say, as Vladimir Lenin said, what's to be done? And that's our challenge.
Thank you. I think we had a question.
aniga waxaan questionkaygu at more fundamental level because I used to be quite nationalist, almost passionate. Dadka oo dhan waan wada naqaana directly or indirectly xaggan jooga Soomaalida. A lot of them across all class, across all region, all profession, asxaab baan nahay, more or less directly, indirectly. Soomaaliduna inta badan way wada dhaleen, business relation bay wada yihiin. There are so many links, no matter how many borders la create gareeyo. So I'm quite pragmatic. Sidoo kale Djibouti, Somaliland, Ethiopia, intaba waxaan ku leeyahay origin. Yeah, which is a big dilemma in a way. But then again, markaan ka fikiray over a long time on akhriyay everything ku saabsan Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, wax oo dhan ba. There is a common thread and issue-yaduna waa always cross-cutting. And it all boils down waxa maxaa la yidhahdaa na haysta waxa weeyaan problem maxaa la yidhahdaa there is some people who don't want madgaratay democratic and by human rights values. Dadkaasina waxay adeegsadaan ignorance iyo poverty-ga ka jirta mandiqadeena. So it's almost irrelevant whether Oromo, Amhara, Anfar, Arab, Somali, waxa loo si kala qaado. I'm almost يعني incredulous وما قاطوا نقول Somalida يعني si kala qaybinayaan يعني it's very hard to believe for me because big picture markaad eegtid I think most fundamental waxa common thread-ka maxaa la yidhahdaa la iskugu iman karaa not simply nationalism which is kind of incoherent philosophy. Nationalism kuma wax inclusive mana aha wax dhinacyo badan markaad eegtid sababsi qumana ba fiican. So rather than nationalism, by definition, is narrow because a lot of identities, Horn of Africa, expert kutai, more or less artificial. So why not look at the democratic human right values, Madgatay, San European kokale, as a confederation Horn of Africa marka loo fiiriyo.
The President Mbeki, I spent some time in South Africa and worked both at the university and in a research institute. When President Mbeki took over the presidency from Mandela, my brother and I were in Pretoria and sitting literally across the park in State House where he spoke. And he said something. And he said, the center must hold for South Africa to remain free. And the reason I want to quote former President Mbeki, someday Africa will recognize how particular kind of a leader he was, despite what the ANC did to him in the last days of his presidency, is the following. There are two kinds of nationalisms. I'm a nationalist through and through, and I make no apologies about that. I remember meeting at the University of Friedberg in Germany in the early part of last decade. A bunch of us, including Abdi Haji Hussein, who traveled with us, and the Germans were so almost such rejectionists of the idea of a nationalism because of National Socialism of Hitler. And so they said, you cannot talk about this. I said, that's your problem. It's your disease. It's not our disease. Okay? There is civic nationalism and there is sectarian nationalism. I'm not going to let the Somali people be sucked to by the Ethiopian regime or the Kenyan regimes who are building their states. And then I will say, oh, it's much better to have a confederation of East African states. Who is going to speak for my people and who is going to represent them in that debate, and what kind of strength would they have when they come to the table? So let me give you an example of Ethiopia itself. When the new regime came to power in Addis and Mengistu fled, there's a piece I wrote in a journal called Third World Quarterly, okay, in 2004, I think it was. I intended to write a book, but never quite was able to finish the field work. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, armed with the EPRDF as the cover, held a conference in Addis Ababa, invited all the nationalities. The key word is invited. Who did they invite? People they thought will be in sync with them, and people they thought will challenge them were not invited into the table. This is the basis of the new Ethiopian federalism and the so-called democracy in Ethiopia. I have deep affection for the Ethiopian people, and I make no apologies for that. My family partly comes from the Somali region, okay? But one of the things that happened was when they were inviting the Somalis, so you see somebody is controlling the platform, inviting some people and disinviting others, okay? So they invited this Somali group, They didn't invite ONLF. I have a problem with ONLF. The name itself, I have a problem. Some of their authorities came to me in Minnesota and said, Abdi, nagada alabto Somali ba nusku wadan hay. Dahaya shega Somali ba ku irada. Say it. But you talk about Ogaden, I'm not Ogaden. If you talk in that language, I am Samaron, and I'm Dir, and I'm the blah, 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 blah. Stop that crap. Yeah, because the argument was that, well, you know, it's the name that's known. So I said, well, I'm a geographer, and the map I showed you earlier on, who created that name? Where did it come from? The point, my friend, is I would love to see a unified Africa, absolutely. I wrote a piece for Al Jazeera, I think in 2012 or 13, actually articulating that, yeah? Where I was talking about one of the ways one can do this is to create what the British and the Dutch and others have done many, many years ago, joint stock companies, joint stock universities, okay? Joint stock university, there will be the University of Science and Technology in Africa, And all the 50 plus states will have a stake and an investment in that. The economies of scale will be mind-boggling. And then we will have the University of Medical Sciences of Africa. And every country will contribute, and we will be able to produce some of the best medical people in the world. I look forward to that, and I hope I'm alive. Okay? The question is then, how are we going to get there? So Muslim ma wadanihin, right? Yeah. Saudi Arabia radoo tagday oo Yusuf waan ku yiri adigoo cimaamadaas sidoo koofiyadaas ee bugger off baa lagu oran doonaa ya Abdi al-Aswad. Marka I want to xeradayda waa inaan urursadaa horta. I have to organize my people so that nobody is inviting them and disinviting them, but that they will be recognized people who are going there on their own merit as a unified force. That and that alone will be the best way to creating the kind of union that you are talking about. So invest in civic education, invest in civic nationalism.
Jazakallah. And on that note, I'd like to wrap up our first episode of Bulsho Cup. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you on episode 2.